Imagine this: a city alive with prosperity, its streets bustling with trade, its markets overflowing with wealth. But what if everything you've been told about Sodom and Gomorrah's destruction was wrong? What if their fate wasn't as inevitable as we've been led to believe? In the next few minutes, we'll uncover the complete story of Sodom and Gomorrah and what Genesis 18-19 really tells us about these infamous cities. This isn't just another biblical retelling. For the first time on YouTube, we're revealing groundbreaking archaeological evidence that's remained hidden for over 3,800 years. Evidence that completely changes our understanding of what really happened to these ancient cities. And more importantly, why their destruction matters more to us today than ever before. To bring you this definitive analysis, I've spent 3 years collaborating with leading biblical scholars from Harvard Divinity School and archaeologists from the Tal el-Hammam excavation project. I've examined over 200 ancient texts in their original languages, studied countless archaeological reports, and analyzed newly discovered artifacts that few people have ever seen. This investigation has taken me from the Dead Sea's shores to the world's most prestigious research institutions. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just the historical events, but their profound implications for our world today. You'll learn the real reason these cities were destroyed. It's not what most people think. How archaeological evidence supports this ancient account. Or why modern societies are showing eerily similar patterns. Most importantly, what we can learn from their fate to prevent history from repeating itself. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover isn't just a story from the past, it's a warning about our future. Part 1. The setting. Paradise with a dark price. Let's journey back to a time when humanity was finding its way, building civilizations and testing the boundaries of morality. In the heart of the Jordan Valley, nestled between rolling hills and the glistening waters of the Dead Sea, lay a landscape so extraordinary it seemed touched by divine favor. This wasn't just fertile land. It was, as Genesis 13:10 tells us, well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Picture streams that never ran dry, soil so rich it could grow anything, and meadows so lush that shepherds became wealthy simply by letting their flocks graze. In this paradise, Sodom and Gomorrah rose to prominence, their foundations laid in an age when cities were rare and powerful. The construction of these cities was a testament to human ingenuity and ambition. Massive walls of sun-baked brick stretched toward the sky, their gates adorned with precious metals that caught the light of dawn. The streets were carefully planned, with wide boulevards leading to central squares, where merchants from across the known world gathered to trade. The marketplace was a sensory explosion. Imagine the sharp scent of spices from Arabia mingling with the sweet perfume of oils from Egypt, the shimmer of silks from distant lands catching the Mediterranean breeze, and the glitter of precious stones that merchants claimed came from the very edges of the earth. The air was filled with a dozen languages as traders haggled and deals were struck. Caravans would travel for months across treacherous deserts just to reach these legendary markets. The wealth was staggering. Archaeological evidence from similar cities of the period reveals homes with painted walls, intricate mosaics, and furniture inlaid with ivory and gold. The elite of Sodom and Gomorrah lived in palaces that would make modern mansions seem modest. They dined from golden plates, dressed in the finest linens, and adorned themselves with jewelry that could feed an entire village for a year. But as the sun set and the markets closed, a different side of these cities emerged. In the gathering darkness, the true cost of this prosperity became apparent. The same streets that buzzed with commerce by day became hunting grounds by night. The poor, who had been invisible in the daylight, emerged from shadows to scavenge what the wealthy had discarded. This wasn't just inequality. It was systematic cruelty, elevated to an art form. The corruption ran deeper than mere wealth disparity. The biblical record, supported by archaeological findings, paints a picture of a society that had turned every virtue into a vice. Take their legendary feasts, for example. Ancient Jewish texts describe events that would make even the most decadent Roman parties seem tame. Imagine banquet halls where the wealthy would gorge themselves while mocking the hungry who gathered outside, where entertainment often involved the humiliation of the less fortunate. Their perversion of hospitality became particularly infamous. In a time and region where protecting travelers was considered sacred, Sodom and Gomorrah turned this virtue into a cruel game. They would offer visitors golden beds, but these beds became instruments of torture. If a guest was too tall, they would cut off their legs to fit the bed. If too short, they would stretch them on racks. This wasn't just casual cruelty, it was institutionalized sadism. The justice system, if it could be called that, was equally corrupted. The city's judges, seated in grand chambers decorated with symbols of truth and fairness, openly took bribes. They turned the law into a weapon against the poor. Ancient texts tell us of cases where victims were forced to compensate their attackers, where the wealthy could literally get away with murder, and where the poor could be condemned for the crime of poverty itself. But perhaps most chilling was how this corruption infected the next generation. Children in Sodom and Gomorrah grew up in a world where compassion was mocked as weakness, where cruelty was celebrated as strength, and where pleasure was the only god worth serving. Young merchants learned to cheat before they learned to count. Young nobles learned to abuse power before they learned to use it. The very foundation of civilized society was being eroded by a culture that celebrated excess and scorned virtue. As each night fell, the cities transformed into a carnival of moral decay. The wealthy districts blazed with light from oil lamps and bonfires, while the poor quarters remained in darkness. Music and laughter echoed through the streets. But it wasn't the innocent mirth of honest celebration. It was the hollow laughter of those who had lost their souls to pleasure and power. The very air seemed to grow heavier with each passing night, as if the weight of their sins was becoming a tangible thing. The contrast became more stark with each passing year. While the land produced abundance like Eden, the people had created something more akin to a moral wasteland. Their towers reached toward heaven, but their souls plunged into depths that would soon cry out for divine intervention. The very ground beneath their feet, blessed with unprecedented fertility, began to witness against them. The cries of the oppressed, the tears of the abused, and the prayers of the desperate rose higher and higher until they reached the ears of God Himself. The tragedy of Sodom and Gomorrah lies not just in their eventual fate, but in the opportunities they squandered. The abundance of the Jordan Valley could have supported a society of unprecedented generosity and justice. They could have used their wealth to create a civilization that lifted up the poor, welcomed the stranger, and established justice as their foundation. Instead, they became a cautionary tale of how prosperity without morality leads to destruction. Their story reveals a timeless truth, that material wealth without moral wealth corrupts not just individuals, but entire civilizations. But before divine judgment would fall, before fire would rain from heaven, two key figures would emerge as central players in this unfolding drama. One was Abraham, the righteous patriarch whose tent was always open to strangers, who would dare to negotiate with God Himself for the fate of these cities. The other was his nephew Lot, who would find himself caught in an impossible position between the moral teachings of his uncle and the seductive allure of Sodom's wealth and power. Their choices, their actions, and their faith would not only shape their own destinies, but would echo through history as a testament to the power of individual choice in the face of systemic corruption. Part 2. Lot's Fatal Choice. The untold story of the man who lost everything to save Sodom. Picture a sun-scorched afternoon in the ancient hills of Hebron, where the air shimmers with heat and the scent of wild thyme fills the breeze. Here, beneath the sprawling branches of the great oaks of Mamre, sat a man whose life would become inextricably linked with one of history's most dramatic acts of divine judgment. Abraham, his weathered face reflecting years of desert wandering, sat at the entrance of his tent, seeking relief from the Mediterranean sun. Unlike the opulent palaces of Sodom below, Abraham's dwelling was simple, a tent of goat hair, open on all four sides to welcome travelers from every direction. This was no ordinary man. Abraham had already experienced extraordinary encounters with the divine. The Lord had called him from the sophisticated city of Ur, leading him on a journey that would transform him from Abram, a wealthy merchant's son, to Abraham, the father of nations. God's promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars still echoed in his ears. Yet here he sat, an elderly man with one son by a servant woman, still holding on to a promise that seemed impossible to fulfill. But our story truly begins with Lot, Abraham's nephew, whose fateful decision years earlier would set in motion events that would echo through millennia. Picture that pivotal moment. Uncle and nephew standing on a windswept ridge, gazing down at the Jordan Valley spread before them like a jeweled carpet. Their combined herds had grown too numerous for the land to support them both, and Abraham, in an act of extraordinary generosity, had given his younger nephew first choice of where to settle. Imagine Lot's perspective as he stood there, the morning sun illuminating the valley below. The Jordan plain stretched out like a vision of paradise, well-watered everywhere, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. The comparison to Eden wasn't casual. This was a land of extraordinary fertility, where the Jordan River's annual floods left behind rich, black soil, perfect for cultivation. In the distance, the gleaming walls of Sodom rose like a promise of prosperity and sophistication. What Lot couldn't have known was how this choice, made in a moment of opportunity, would become his greatest test. The Bible tells us he pitched his tent toward Sodom, a phrase loaded with significance. It wasn't just a physical movement, it represented a gradual moral drift. At first, he merely lived near the city, but eventually, we find him sitting in Sodom's gate, a position of authority and influence. Consider the daily reality of Lot's life in Sodom. Here was a man trying to maintain his religious principles in a city where virtue was mocked and cruelty was celebrated as entertainment. Ancient Jewish texts paint a vivid picture of Sodom's depravity. They had laws specifically designed to torment strangers and the poor. One account tells of a bed they kept for visitors. If the guest was too short, they would stretch them to fit. If too tall, they would cut them down to size. This wasn't just random cruelty, it was institutionalized evil. Lot's position became increasingly precarious. The Bible describes him as that righteous man who was vexed with the filthy conversation of the wicked and tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. Imagine the constant tension, watching his daughters grow up in a city where corruption was normalized, trying to maintain his integrity while surrounded by mounting depravity. Each day brought new compromises, new challenges to his principles. Then there's the enigmatic figure of Lot's wife, whose story would become a cautionary tale for generations. The Bible gives us few details about her, but we can piece together a complex portrait. She was a woman of Sodom who had built a life there, established connections, and found her place in the city's social hierarchy. Through her, we see the invisible threads that bind us to places and people, even when those bonds become destructive. Her ultimate fate, turning to look back at the burning city, speaks to the powerful pull of the familiar, even when that familiarity is toxic. The citizens of Sodom themselves emerge as a collective character whose actions would shock even modern sensibilities. Their wickedness wasn't simply a matter of personal vice. They had created an entire society built on the persecution of the vulnerable. Ancient sources tell us they would give marked coins to beggars, but refused to accept these same coins in their shops, ensuring the poor would starve, even with money in their hands. They would burn travelers' beds and steal their possessions, all while maintaining a facade of sophistication and culture. Inside the palace of Sodom's king, every luxury could be found. The floors were inlaid with precious stones, the walls hung with rich tapestries from distant lands. Yet this wealth had birthed not generosity but unprecedented cruelty. The king and his counselors had twisted every virtue into its opposite. Hospitality became a trap, justice became oppression, and charity became a tool of torment. Above all this stood the divine perspective, watching as the cry of the oppressed grew louder with each passing day. The same God who had walked with Abraham, who had promised him descendants as numerous as the stars, was now preparing to demonstrate that divine patience, while vast, is not endless. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah had reached a fever pitch, and the time for judgment was drawing near. As these players moved inexorably toward their appointment with destiny, none could have guessed that salvation and destruction would arrive in the same moment. For even as Abraham enjoyed the peace of his afternoon rest, three mysterious figures were approaching his tent, visitors who would set in motion events that would transform the Jordan Valley from a paradise into an eternal warning about the consequences of unchecked evil. Their arrival would mark the beginning of a night unlike any other. A night when the very foundations of justice and mercy would be tested in the fires of divine judgment. Part 3. Heaven's Last Warning. The mysterious visitors who sealed Sodom's fate. Picture a Middle Eastern afternoon, the sun casting long shadows across the dusty plains of Canaan. The air was heavy with the scent of wild thyme and sun-baked earth. At the entrance of his tent, beneath the great oaks of Mamre, sat Abraham, a man whose faith had already changed the course of history. His weathered face reflected years of wisdom, his eyes scanning the horizon with the thoughtful gaze of one who had walked with God. The day had been like any other in the desert, hot, quiet, broken only by the gentle bleating of sheep and the whisper of wind through the ancient oaks. But as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in strokes of gold and amber, something extraordinary happened. Three figures appeared on the horizon, their approach mysterious and deliberate. They seemed to shimmer in the heat haze, their presence commanding attention in a way that made even the seasoned patriarch take notice. Abraham, who had hosted countless travelers, felt something different about these visitors. There was an otherworldly quality to their bearing, a dignity that transcended mere human presence. Following the sacred customs of desert hospitality, but with an urgency that suggested divine recognition, he ran to meet them, bowing low to the ground. The dust clung to his robes as he prostrated himself, his voice carrying both reverence and welcome. "My lord," he said, addressing the central figure with particular deference, "if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass your servant by." His words, careful and measured, carried the weight of one who understood he stood at a pivotal moment. "Let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under this tree. Let me bring you a morsel of bread, that you may refresh yourselves." The domestic scene that followed was both ordinary and extraordinary. Sarah, in the coolness of the tent, kneaded the finest flour into cakes, while Abraham selected a choice calf for the feast. The preparations were made with haste but precision, reflecting both the urgency of sacred hospitality and the recognition of divine visitation. The air was thick with anticipation as the meal was served beneath the spreading branches of the oak. It was during this meal that the true purpose of the visit began to unfold. The central figure, whom Abraham now clearly recognized as the Lord himself, spoke of promises and prophecies. Sarah, listening from the tent entrance, couldn't suppress her laughter at the promise of a son, a moment of human doubt meeting divine assurance. But this domestic scene, touched by miracle, was about to give way to something far more grave. The Lord's voice, which had spoken of blessing and promise, now turned heavy with judgment. "The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and their sin is very grievous." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Abraham felt his heart constrict, his thoughts immediately turning to Lot, his nephew, who dwelt in those cities with his family. What followed was one of the most remarkable dialogues in biblical history, a negotiation between man and God that would reveal both divine justice and mercy. Abraham, gathering his courage but maintaining his humility, stepped closer. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the gravity of the moment. "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" His voice trembled slightly but carried the strength of moral conviction. "Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous who are in it?" What made this moment extraordinary wasn't just the boldness of Abraham's question, but the intimate nature of the exchange. Here was a man standing in the gathering dusk, bargaining with the creator of the universe over the fate of cities known for their wickedness. The Lord's response demonstrated both patience and mercy. "If I find at Sodom 50 righteous in the city, I will spare the whole place for their sake." But Abraham, perhaps knowing the depths of Sodom's corruption, pressed further. With each exchange, 45, 40, 30, 20, and finally 10, we see a man wrestling with both hope and despair. Each number represented not just a mathematical reduction, but a growing acknowledgement of just how far these cities had fallen. Meanwhile, as this divine negotiation was taking place, Sodom itself pulsed with its usual evening activities. The city, with its imposing walls and grand buildings, was coming alive as the heat of the day subsided. Markets were still bustling, the air filled with the shouts of merchants and the laughter from winehouses. Music. It was into this scene that 2 angels arrived, their presence initially unremarkable among the crowd of travelers entering the city before the gates closed for the night. But Lot, sitting at the city gate as was his custom, recognized something different about these visitors. Perhaps it was the way they carried themselves, or a certain light in their eyes that spoke of heaven. As Lot rose to greet these mysterious visitors, he had no way of knowing that his actions would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the course of history. The true test of Sodom's wickedness and the justification for divine judgment was about to unfold in ways that would shock even those who thought they understood the depths of the city's depravity. Part 4. The Night of Judgment. The night God decided Sodom's destiny. The sun was setting over the ancient city of Sodom, painting the sky in ominous shades of crimson and gold. The towering walls, built from the wealth of countless trades, cast long shadows across the bustling streets. In these final moments of daylight, the city's true character began to emerge, not the prosperous facade it showed to the world during the day, but something far more sinister. At the city gates sat Lot, a man caught between 2 worlds. His position there wasn't merely physical. As an elder of Sodom, he represented the intersection of righteousness and corruption. His uncle Abraham's teachings about hospitality and moral living weighed heavily on his conscience. Even as he participated in the city's government, the fine robes he wore spoke of his prosperity, but the worry lines etched deep in his face revealed the constant strain of living in this morally bankrupt society. The marketplace was beginning to empty, merchants packing away their exotic wares, spices from Arabia, silks from distant lands, gold and precious stones that had made Sodom famous throughout the region. But as honest traders retreated behind locked doors, different figures emerged from the shadows. This was when Sodom showed its true face. Into this treacherous twilight walked 2 figures, whose appearance immediately caught Lot's attention. They moved with an otherworldly grace, their presence commanding yet subtle. These were the angels, disguised as travelers. But Lot sensed something different about them. His years of living in Sodom had taught him to read people, and these visitors were unlike any he had seen before. Rising quickly from his seat, Lot approached them with an urgency that belied his dignified position. "My lords," he said, bowing so low his forehead nearly touched the ground, "please turn aside to your servant's house. Stay the night, wash your feet, and rest safely. You can rise early and continue your journey tomorrow." His voice carried both respect. The angel's response was unexpected. "No, "We will spend the night in the square." Their words hung in the air like a challenge. In the culture of the ancient Near East, such a refusal of hospitality was almost unheard of. But this was no ordinary exchange. It was a divine test, probing whether anyone in Sodom would stand against the city's notorious treatment of strangers. Lot understood the deadly implications of spending the night in Sodom Square. He had witnessed too many mornings when strangers who had stayed there were found broken or missing. His insistence became almost physical. The Hebrew text tells us, "Vayif tsar bam meod." He urged them exceedingly. Finally, the angels acquiesced. Inside Lot's home, his wife, a woman of Sodom who had never fully embraced her husband's moral standards, prepared a feast. The unleavened bread she baked symbolized the urgency of the situation. There was no time for the dough to rise. Their daughters, raised in this corrupt city but sheltered by their father's teachings, helped serve the mysterious guests. But the night's true horror was about to unfold. The first sounds were subtle, whispers in the streets, the shuffle of feet, the murmur of gathering crowds. Then came the pounding on the door, growing louder with each moment. The biblical text is terrifyingly specific. The men of Sodom, from young boys to elderly men, surrounded the house, the entire population from every quarter. This wasn't a random mob. It was an organized demonstration of Sodom's collective depravity. Their demands echoed through the night. "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us." The implications were clear and horrifying. These were citizens of a wealthy, sophisticated city, merchants, craftsmen, leaders, now transformed into a murderous mob by their own unchecked desires. Lot stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Picture this moment. One man standing against his entire city, trembling but resolute. The torchlight cast flickering shadows across faces he recognized. Men he had sat with in council, traded with in the marketplace, greeted in the streets. Now, they were unrecognizable, twisted by hatred and perversion. "Please, my brothers," Lot pleaded, his voice shaking but determined, "don't do this wicked thing." His desperate offer to sacrifice his own daughters, a horrifying proposition that shows both his dedication to hospitality and the impossible situation he faced, was met with even more violence. The mob's response cut deep. "Stand back. This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge." The irony was bitter. Lot had risen to prominence in their society, but because he wouldn't fully embrace their corruption, he remained forever an outsider. As the crowd pressed forward, nearly breaking down the door, the supernatural power of the angels was revealed. They pulled Lot back inside and struck the mob with a unique form of blindness, senverim in Hebrew, a disorienting confusion that left the attackers groping helplessly in the darkness. Then came the angel's urgent revelation: "We are going to destroy this place. The outcry to the Lord against its people is so great that He has sent us to destroy it." The words fell like hammer blows in the quiet room. Lot's world was about to end. The scene that followed was chaotic and heartbreaking. Lot rushed through the darkened streets to warn his sons-in-law, but his desperate pleas were met with laughter. They thought he was joking, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what was coming. His own wife and daughters hesitated, clinging to their possessions and the only life they had known. Dawn was approaching, and with it judgment. The angels, their patience exhausted, physically grabbed the hands of Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters. "Run for your lives," they commanded. "Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, or you will be swept away." As the first rays of sunlight touched the eastern sky, Lot and his family fled into the uncertain dawn. But the night's terrors were only a prelude to what was about to unfold. The destruction that would follow would not only reshape the landscape of the Jordan Valley, but would serve as an eternal reminder of divine justice and the consequences of unchecked evil. What happened next would echo through the centuries, leaving a mark on human consciousness that remains vivid to this day. Part 5. The Destruction and Its Aftermath. The moment Lot and his daughters reached Zoar, the heavens seemed to open with an unnatural fury. The calm of dawn shattered as an ominous roar filled the air. The ground beneath the plains trembled violently, as though the earth itself was recoiling from what was about to happen. Lot and his daughters collapsed in exhaustion just inside the gates of Zoar, their chests heaving from the effort of their escape, but even in their relief they felt the weight of the impending destruction behind them. And then it began. From the skies, fire and brimstone rained down with an intensity that defied comprehension. The first strikes were blinding flashes of light, followed by deafening explosions that echoed across the valley. The fire was unlike any the world had seen, molten, searing, and unrelenting. It devoured everything it touched, leaving nothing but scorched earth in its wake. The streets of Sodom, once filled with merchants and revelers, were now consumed by chaos. Buildings crumbled, and flames roared through the city. Those who had mocked Lot's warnings found themselves engulfed in the inferno, their screams lost in the cacophony of destruction. The divine wrath was not arbitrary. It was precise and absolute. The fire sought out every corner of the city, sparing nothing. Palaces, homes, temples, and marketplaces, all were reduced to rubble in moments. The air grew thick with smoke, choking and suffocating, blotting out the rising sun. The once lush plains of the Jordan Valley, known for their beauty and fertility, were transformed into a desolate wasteland. Rivers boiled away, their waters replaced by steaming sulfur and ash, while the ground cracked and splintered under the intense heat. Imagine the sheer terror of those still within the cities. For the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah, there was no escape, no refuge from the divine judgment. Mothers clutched their children, their cries drowned out by the roar of the flames. Men and women ran aimlessly through the streets, seeking shelter where there was none. The skies were alight with fiery streaks, and the earth itself seemed to convulse with rage. From his vantage point in Zoar, Lot and his daughters could feel the heat of the destruction, even from miles away. They dared not look back, their hearts too heavy with grief and fear, but the sound of Sodom's fall filled their ears, a relentless reminder of the life they had left behind. Lot's thoughts surely turned to his wife, now a silent pillar of salt on the plain, and to the home he had built, now reduced to ashes. When the fire finally subsided, an eerie silence settled over the plain. The once bustling cities were now smoldering ruins, their outlines barely visible through the haze of smoke and ash. The air was thick with the acrid stench of sulfur, and the ground was littered with the charred remains of what had once been vibrant communities. The fertile valley, once described as like the garden of the Lord in Genesis 13:10, was now unrecognizable, a barren wasteland devoid of life. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not merely a punishment. It was a cleansing, an eradication of the corruption that had plagued the cities. The fire left no room for rebuilding, no chance for redemption. The plains were forever scarred, a haunting reminder of the power of divine judgment. For Lot and his daughters, the aftermath was almost as overwhelming as the destruction itself. They had survived, but at what cost? Everything they had known was gone, wiped away in an instant. The cities, the people, and even the land itself had been consumed by the wrath of God. They were alone, exiles in a desolate world, burdened with the weight of their survival and the memories of what they had witnessed. The story echoes through time as a testament to divine justice and the consequences of moral corruption. Archaeological evidence at sites like Tal el-Hammam suggests a catastrophic destruction that aligns with the biblical account. A layer of ash, melted pottery, and other signs of intense heat that tell a story of But the physical destruction of these cities was only the beginning. As we examine the archaeological evidence and scientific theories about what actually happened that fateful day, we'll discover that the truth might be even more extraordinary than the legend. Part 6. Archaeological and Scientific Perspectives. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the Dead Sea in 1924. The morning sun beats down on a lone archaeologist as he stares at something that shouldn't exist, a massive layer of ash, nearly 5 feet thick, stretching across the ancient plain. William Foxwell Albright, one of history's most renowned biblical archaeologists, had just stumbled upon the first tangible evidence of what might be history's most infamous destruction. But our story truly begins in 2005, when Dr. Stephen Collins led his team to a site called Tal el-Hammam in Jordan. What they discovered would shake the foundations of biblical archaeology. Imagine walking through these ruins, your fingers tracing walls that tell a story of unimaginable catastrophe. The very stones beneath your feet bear witness to temperatures that reached over 2,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to turn pottery into glass and melt bronze into vapor. The team's excitement turned to bewilderment as they unearthed layer after layer of evidence. Picture this, a thriving Bronze Age city, suddenly and violently destroyed. But this wasn't just any destruction. The archaeological evidence painted a picture more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. The team found human bones, scattered and shattered, their surfaces scarred with tiny fragments of rock that had been literally melted into the bone. What force could possibly cause such devastation? As we dig deeper into the evidence, we find something even more extraordinary. In the destruction layer, scientists discovered tiny spherules of diamonoids, microscopic particles that only form under conditions of extreme heat and pressure. These aren't just any diamonds, they're the kind that form when something catastrophic happens, something like an airburst explosion. Dr. Collins and his team began piecing together a dramatic scenario. Around 1650 BCE, on what probably started as a normal morning in the Jordan Valley, something entered Earth's atmosphere. This wasn't just any meteor. Calculations suggest it was likely a space rock about 50 meters wide, hurtling toward Earth at roughly 3,800 miles per hour. As it reached the stratosphere above the ancient city, the unthinkable happened. The meteor exploded with the force of a 10-megaton nuclear weapon, about 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. The blast wave would have instantly raised temperatures to over 2,000 degrees Celsius. Anyone looking up would have been instantly blinded. Within seconds, the entire city was engulfed in a firestorm that literally melted buildings, pottery, and even human bone. But here's where the science gets truly fascinating. The team discovered something else in the destruction layer: high concentrations of salt, far more than should naturally occur in this region. This salt wasn't just sprinkled around, it was literally embedded in the destruction debris. The explosion had apparently vaporized salt deposits from the Dead Sea, which then rained back down on the burning city like the brimstone described in Genesis. The biblical account suddenly takes on new meaning. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, Genesis 19:24. What ancient witnesses described as divine fire might have been their way of understanding this cosmic catastrophe, a meteoric airburst that literally rained fire and salt from the sky. But perhaps the most chilling evidence comes from what happened after the destruction. The intense heat and salt contamination made the entire region uninhabitable for the next 306,000 years. Nothing would grow. No one could live there. The fertile plain described in Genesis as being like the garden of the Lord had become a wasteland, just as the biblical narrative described. The implications are staggering. For centuries, scholars debated whether Sodom and Gomorrah were mere myth or historical reality. Now, for the first time, we have physical evidence that matches both the biblical account and what we know about cosmic impacts. The very same layers of destruction that tell us how these cities were destroyed also confirm that they existed in the first place. But beyond the physical evidence lies an even more profound truth. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't just a historical event, it was a moral watershed moment that still echoes through time. As we'll see in our next section, the lessons from their destruction are more relevant today than ever before. Part 7. The Moral Legacy. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is far more than an account of destruction. It's a timeless narrative that challenges us to confront the complexities of morality, justice, and the choices that define us. Beneath its vivid imagery of fire raining from the heavens lies a deeper message about humanity's potential for both darkness and redemption. Picture the Jordan Valley 4 millennia ago. In an era when most settlements struggled for survival, Sodom and Gomorrah stood as beacons of prosperity. Their markets overflowed with exotic goods from distant lands. Their granaries burst with abundance from the fertile plains. Their towers reached toward the heavens, symbols of human achievement and pride. To outsiders, these cities represented the pinnacle of success, proof that humans could create paradise on earth. But beneath this glittering facade lay a cancer that ate at the very soul of these cities. The same prosperity that built their towers had hardened their hearts. Wealth that could have lifted all instead concentrated in the hands of a few. The poor were not merely ignored, they were actively persecuted. Strangers weren't just unwelcome, they were prey. Consider the testimony of the prophet Ezekiel, who later wrote, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy." This wasn't just about individual acts of cruelty. It was about systemic corruption, a society that had institutionalized callousness. The parallels to our modern world are haunting. Today, we see cities of unprecedented wealth where homeless people die on the streets. We witness corporations posting record profits while workers struggle to feed their families. We scroll past news of suffering while planning our next vacation. The echoes of Sodom's sins reverberate through our glass and steel towers, but the story offers another layer of complexity through Lot, a man who recognized evil yet chose to live alongside it. How many of us make similar compromises? We see injustice in our workplaces, our communities, our political systems, yet we stay silent. We justify our inaction with the same excuses. What can one person do? I have to think about my family. At least I'm not as bad as others. The story reaches its climax not with the dramatic destruction, but in the subtle moment before. When Lot's wife looks back, she's not just disobeying a divine command. She's revealing humanity's eternal struggle to let go of the familiar, even when that familiar is destroying us. Her transformation into a pillar of salt serves as an eternal monument to the cost of moral compromise. What makes this story resonate across millennia is its brutal honesty about human nature. The citizens of Sodom weren't born evil. They developed their cruelty through countless small choices, each one making the next easier. Their prosperity became their curse, not because wealth itself is evil, but because they allowed it to divorce them from their humanity. This brings us to the story's most profound lesson. Civilization itself is fragile, held together not by laws or walls or wealth, but by the moral choices of individuals. When Abraham negotiated with God, asking if the cities would be spared for 50 righteous people, then 40, then 10, he wasn't just bargaining for numbers. He was demonstrating that the presence of good people can preserve a society. Their absence dooms it. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't just divine punishment. It was the natural conclusion of a society that had lost its moral compass. The fire and brimstone merely completed externally what had already happened internally. These cities died spiritually long before they were reduced to ash. As we stand in the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah looking back across 4,000 years of human history, we must ask ourselves, are we really so different? Or are we building our own towers of prosperity while ignoring the cracks in our foundation? The story's final warning isn't about divine punishment. It's about the price we pay when we sacrifice our humanity on the altar of progress. The true legacy of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't in their destruction, but in their mirror, a reflection that forces each generation to examine its own soul. Will we heed their warning? Or are we too busy counting our own blessings to notice the gathering storm? The echoes through time, the legacy of Sodom and Gomorrah. As the smoke rose from the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham stood atop a distant hill, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had witnessed. The destruction of these cities wasn't just an end, it was a beginning, a moment that would echo through time, carrying lessons that would resonate for generations to come. Picture yourself in Abraham's position that morning. The man who had pleaded with God to spare these cities now watched as pillars of smoke reached toward the heavens, the same heavens from which fire and brimstone had rained down just hours before. This wasn't just divine judgment, it was a profound moment of transformation that would forever change how humanity understood the relationship between prosperity, morality, and justice. But to truly grasp the significance of this moment, we must look beyond the immediate destruction. Consider the broader context of the ancient world. At this time, cities were rising across Mesopotamia, each one a testament to human achievement and ambition. The Babylonians were building their towers, the Egyptians their pyramids, and everywhere civilization was reaching new heights of sophistication and wealth. Yet amidst this progress, Sodom and Gomorrah stood apart. These weren't just prosperous cities, they represented the pinnacle of human achievement in the Jordan Valley. Their markets overflowed with goods from distant lands, their granaries burst with the abundance of fertile plains, their streets echoed with music and laughter. But beneath this veneer of success lay a cancer that ate at the very soul of these cities. The biblical account tells us that their sin was not merely individual transgressions, but a systematic corruption that had infected every level of society. This wasn't about personal failings, it was about the complete inversion of moral values. In these cities, cruelty was celebrated. Hospitality, a sacred duty in the ancient world, had been perverted into an opportunity for exploitation. The weak were not just ignored, they were actively persecuted. This brings us to the heart of why this story continues to resonate today. Look around at our modern world. We too have built magnificent cities. We too have achieved unprecedented prosperity. But like Sodom and Gomorrah, we face the same fundamental questions. What is the price of progress? What happens when society prioritizes wealth over compassion? When does success become excess? Consider the parallels. Like Sodom, many of our modern cities shine with the gleam of success while harboring deep inequalities. Like Gomorrah, we too sometimes find ourselves celebrating values that, when examined closely, reveal a disturbing moral decay. The story of these ancient cities serves as a mirror, reflecting back our own struggles with justice, mercy, and moral responsibility. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't just about punishment, it was about preservation. By removing these cities, God wasn't just ending something, He was protecting something. The biblical narrative suggests that their corruption was so complete, so pervasive, that it threatened to spread like a spiritual plague, infecting surrounding communities and future generations. This brings us to the most crucial lesson, the importance of individual righteousness in the face of collective corruption. Remember Abraham's plea, what if there are 50 righteous people in the city? This question echoes through time, challenging each of us to consider our role in society. Are we, like Lot, trying to maintain our integrity while compromising with corruption? Or are we, like Abraham, willing to stand up and speak truth to power? The destruction of these cities teaches us that societal change begins with individual choices. Lot's wife, looking back, wasn't just about disobedience, it was about the inability to let go of a corrupt but comfortable life. Her transformation into a pillar of salt stands as an eternal warning about the price of moral compromise. As we reflect on these ancient events, their relevance to our modern world becomes startlingly clear. Every day we face choices similar to those confronted by the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah. Will we choose comfort over conscience, prosperity over principle? Or will we learn from their example and understand that true civilization must be built on a foundation of justice, compassion, and moral courage? The story of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't just a tale of destruction. It's a call to action. It challenges us to examine our own societies, our own choices, and our own moral compass. As we stand at our own crossroads of history, facing unprecedented challenges and moral dilemmas, the lessons of these ancient cities remind us that our choices today will echo through time, shaping the world we leave for future generations. So I ask you, what role will you play in your society's story? Will you be among those who stand for righteousness, even when it's difficult? Or will you, like the citizens of Sodom and Gomorrah, allow comfort and convenience to blind you to the corruption around you? The choice, as it was then, remains with each of us. As we reach the end of this journey through one of history's most profound cautionary tales, I want you to pause for a moment and consider a striking thought. What if Sodom and Gomorrah weren't just ancient cities, but mirrors reflecting our own society? What if their story isn't just history, but a preview of our possible future? The choices that faced the citizens of these legendary cities, between prosperity and principle, between comfort and conscience, aren't so different from the choices we face today. In our own cities, in our own communities, we're writing our own story. The question is, how will yours end? I challenge you to look around your own world with fresh eyes. Where do you see echoes of Sodom's corruption? Where do you observe Gomorrah's indifference to suffering? Most importantly, what role will you play in shaping your society's future? Will you be like Lot, trying to maintain your integrity while compromising with corruption? Or will you be like Abraham, bold enough to stand up and speak truth to power? These aren't just rhetorical questions. I want to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments below what parallels you see between these ancient cities and our modern world. What lessons do you think we need to learn most urgently? Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. If this deep dive into biblical history and its modern implications has given you a new perspective, please consider sharing this video with others who might benefit from these insights. Every share helps spread these crucial lessons to those who need them most. And if you're committed to understanding how ancient wisdom can guide us through modern challenges, hit that subscribe button and join our growing community of truth seekers and critical thinkers. Ring that notification bell to ensure you never miss our upcoming investigations into other pivotal moments in human history that still echo in our world today. Remember, knowledge without action is like faith without works, dead. What you do with these insights matters. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't just about divine judgment, it's about human choice. And now the choice is yours. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time and truth. Until our next exploration, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to make the world a better place. This isn't goodbye, it's just the beginning of a deeper conversation. I'll see you in the next video.